Sudan's ex-president Omar al-Bashir arrives for trial. This is the photo of Omar al-Bashir. He took power in a 1989 coup. Then he was toppled by the military in 2019. This is another photo of his. In June, Omar al-Bashir was seen in public for the first time outside the prosecutor's office in Khartoum. In this photo you see, there have been protests on the streets of Sudan for months. News script taken from BBC. All photos may not represent the story. Watch to become bilingual, as this video is especially made for English learners. Sudan's former President Omar al-Bashir has arrived at court to face corruption charges, which his lawyers say are baseless. Mr. Bashir was ousted in April after months of protests bringing an end to his nearly 30 years in power. In June, prosecutors said a large hoard of foreign currency had been found in grain sacks at his home. On Sunday, pro-democracy activists and the country's military leaders signed a deal paving the way for elections. There was heavy security outside the courthouse in the Sudanese capital, Khartoum, witnesses say. The former president arrived with a large military convoy, AFP news agency reports. What are the corruption charges? The former president faces charges related to possessing foreign currency, corruption and receiving gifts illegally. In April, Sudan's military ruler General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan said more than $113 million (£93 million) worth of cash in Sudanese pounds and foreign currency had been seized from Mr. Bashir's home. Mr. Bashir's defense team rejects the charges. The ousted leader had been due in court in July, but the trial was postponed for security reasons. What other charges does Mr. Bashir face in Sudan? In May, Sudan's public prosecutor charged Mr. Bashir with incitement and involvement in the killing of protesters. The charges stem from an inquiry into the death of a doctor killed during protests that led to the end of Mr. Bashir's rule in April. The doctor had been treating injured protesters in his home in Khartoum when police fired tear gas into the building. A witness told the BBC that the doctor had walked out with his hands in the air, told the police he was a doctor and was instantly shot. What about the transition to democracy? Mr. Bashir's trial will be seen as a test of whether the new authorities are able to deal with the alleged crimes of the previous regime. On Saturday, Sudan's ruling military council, which took over after Mr. Bashir's ousting, and civilian opposition alliance signed a landmark power-sharing deal. The agreement ushers in a new governing council, including both civilians and generals, to pave the way towards elections and civilian rule. Mohamed Hamdan Hemeti Dagalo, widely regarded as Sudan's most powerful man, has pledged to abide by its terms. The members of the new Sovereign Council were supposed to be sworn in on Monday, but the ceremony has been postponed for 48 hours after a request from pro-democracy activists. The Reuters news agency quotes a military spokesman as saying, "Sudan's ousted President Omar al-Bashir's career has been defined by war. He came to power in a military coup in 1989 and ruled what was until 2011 Africa's largest country with an iron fist. When he seized power, Sudan was in the midst of a 21-year civil war between North and South. Although his government signed a deal to end that conflict in 2005, another one was breaking out at the same time, in the western region of Darfur, where Mr. Bashir is accused of organizing war crimes and crimes against humanity by the International Criminal Court (ICC). Despite an international arrest warrant issued by the ICC, he won consecutive elections in 2010 and 2015. However, his last victory was marred by a boycott from the main opposition parties. The arrest warrant has led to an international travel ban. However, Mr. Bashir has still made diplomatic visits to various countries, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia and South Africa. He was forced into a hasty departure from South Africa in June 2015 after a court considered whether to enforce the arrest warrant. Before taking the helm, he was a commander in the army, responsible for leading operations in the south against the late rebel leader John Garang. When he signed the peace deal with Garang and his Sudan People's Liberation Movement, he took pains to stress the deal had not been a defeat. "We did not sign it after we had been broken. We signed it while we were at the peak of our victories," he said. Accusations against Omar al-Bashir. Genocide 1. Killing members of the Fur, Masalit and Zaghawa ethnic groups 2. Causing these groups serious bodily or mental harm 3. Inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about these groups' physical destruction. Crimes against humanity 1. Murder 2. Extermination 3. Forcible transfer 4. Rape 5. Torture. War crimes 1. Attacks on civilians in Darfur 2. Pillaging towns and villages. His goal was always to keep a unified Sudan, but a referendum on secession for South Sudan was agreed as part of the peace deal. In the January 2011 referendum, about 99% of South Sudanese voters were in favor of separation. The independent state of South Sudan was declared 6 months later. While he agreed to let South Sudan go, his attitude to Darfur, where a conflict has raged since 2003 when rebels took up arms at alleged government discrimination, has been characterized by belligerence. But he denies international accusations that he has backed Arab Janjaweed militias accused of war crimes against the region's black African communities. Military background: Mr. Bashir was born in 1944 to a farming family in northern Sudan, then Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. He is a member of al-Badariyar al-Darmashia, a Bedouin tribe belonging to the larger Jalan group. He joined the Egyptian army as a young man and rose through the ranks, fighting in the 1973 war against Israel. Little is known about his private life. He has no children and took a second wife in his 50s. He married the widow of Ibrahim Shams al-Din, considered a war hero in the north, as an example to others, he said. The long civil war had seen many colleagues fall, and he implored others to marry again so war widows could be taken care of. As head of state, his focus largely remained soldiering, the political lead being taken by 2 other figures. The first in the 1990s was Hassan al-Turabi, a prominent Sunni Muslim who until his death in 2016 advocated an Islamic state and ushered in a bill introducing Sharia to all provinces but the south. After they fell out in 2000, Mr. Turabi told the BBC, he's a military person who has been in power for a while and he wants to assert military power. Then Osman Ali Taha, a politician who negotiated the North-South deal, came to the fore. But his influence waned and the president took center stage. Sudan analyst Alex Deval said Mr. Bashir's longevity in office was probably down to the fact that powerful rivals in the ruling National Congress Party distrusted each other more than they did Mr. Bashir. But political unrest gained momentum quickly. Nationwide protests first started in December 2018 after the government announced that prices for fuel and bread would rise. This turned into a wider call for Mr. Bashir and his government to step down. Mr. Bashir declared a state of emergency in February 2019, reshuffling his cabinet and replacing all state governors with members of the army and security forces. After months of unrest, Sudan's military stepped in and finally toppled Mr. Bashir on the 11th of April 2019. Mr. Bashir was later charged with incitement and involvement in the killing of protesters. He also faces corruption charges, after prosecutors said a large hoard of foreign currency was found at his home. Oil money flows, and leaves. For a while during his presidency, there were pockets full of dollars as the oil flowed, controls were lifted and the telecommunications system revolutionized. But the economy floundered since the secession of the South, which took 3/4 of the country's oil with it. Ever since, belts have had to be tightened in Khartoum. Mr. Bashir, who became president when it was punishable by death to be found in possession of US dollars, has denied accusations that access to government funds and oil money was an underlying cause of the unrest in Darfur. It was perhaps inevitable that a soldier president could only be brought down by the armed forces. Once they lost faith in his ability to maintain stability in the country, there was little he could do. Despite the corruption trial, there will be little appetite to send him to also face justice at the ICC, as some of those who fought for him in Darfur retain considerable power and influence under Sudan's new dispensation. Sudan has been in the midst of a political crisis since long-serving ruler Omar al-Bashir was overthrown in April. The military and pro-democracy movement have been locked in a tussle for power that has led to mass protests and killings. The security forces have used brute force to strengthen the position of the generals. In the worst such case, dozens of people were killed, and some had their bodies thrown into the River Nile, in a crackdown on protesters in the capital, Khartoum, on the 3rd of June. But tens of thousands of protesters returned to the streets a few weeks later to stage the biggest demonstration since Mr. Bashir's overthrow. This forced the junta to resume talks on a power-sharing government, and an agreement has now been reached. Here's what you need to know about the crisis. How did it all begin? The unrest in Sudan can be traced back to December 2018, when then President Bashir's government imposed emergency austerity measures to try to stave off economic collapse. Cuts to bread and fuel subsidies sparked demonstrations in the east over living standards, and the anger spread to the capital, Khartoum. The protests broadened into demands for the removal of Mr. Bashir, who had been in charge for 30 years, and his government. The movement reached a climax on the 6th of April, when demonstrators occupied the square in front of the military's headquarters to demand that the army force the president out. 5 days later, the military announced that the president had been overthrown. So who took power? A council of generals assumed power on the 11th of April, but it has struggled to return normality to the country. The 7-member Transitional Military Council (TMC) is led by Lieutenant Gen Abdel Fattah Abdulrahman Burhan. The council says it needs to be in charge to ensure order and security. But the army is not a unified force in Sudan. Paramilitary organizations and various Islamist militias hold some sway. The military has also faced international condemnation for the attack on protesters on the 3rd of June, with the UK saying the military council bore full responsibility. In response, the TMC expressed sorrow for the way events escalated, saying that the operation had targeted troublemakers and petty criminals. Who are the opposition? The economic problems brought Sudanese from all walks of life to the streets, but the organization of demonstrations was taken on by the Sudanese Professionals Association (SPA), a collaboration of doctors, health workers and lawyers. The protesters are mostly young, reflecting the country's demographics, but people of all ages have been seen in the crowds. Women are at the forefront of the demonstrations. A video of a young woman standing on the roof of a car and leading the chants was widely shared on social media. When the military took power in April, demonstrators stayed put outside its headquarters and insisted that it transfer authority to a civilian administration. Talks between the ruling generals and the protest organizers, who have come together under the umbrella group Forces of Freedom and Change, initially showed little sign of progress, but they eventually came to an agreement. What did the two sides agree? The military and protesters have reached several agreements fleshing out the details of a power-sharing arrangement, with each side trying to overcome suspicion and build a working relationship. On the 4th of August they signed a constitutional declaration which will pave the way for the formation of a transitional government. A formal signing ceremony is due to take place on the 17th of August. They have agreed on the following: 1. Power sharing will last for 39 months. 2. Elections to be held at the end of that period. 3. A sovereign council, cabinet and legislative body will be formed. 4. A general will head the council for the first 21 months, a civilian for the remaining 18. 5. Sovereign council will have 11 members, 5 civilian and 5 military nominees plus 1 agreed by consensus. 6. A prime minister, nominated by the pro-democracy movement, will head the cabinet. 7. The ministers of defense and interior will be chosen by the military. 8. The other positions will be taken by pro-democracy candidates. 9. Sovereign council and cabinet members barred from running for election. The long transition period is seen as a victory for the pro-democracy movement. The generals had threatened a snap election after the 3rd of June crackdown. Demonstrators argued that Mr. Bashir's regime was so deeply entrenched that it would take time to dismantle its political network and open the way for free and fair elections. What has the international response to the crisis been? Most African and Western countries have backed the protesters. But Egypt, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are seen to be allies of the junta. They perhaps fear the protests in Sudan could inspire similar events to take place in their countries. The TMC's vice president, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemati, flew to Saudi Arabia in June to meet the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, promising to stand with the kingdom against threats and continue sending Sudanese troops to help the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. The O suspended Sudan as a member of the Pan-African body after the 3rd of June crackdown, saying it will be reinstated only after a civilian-led transitional authority is established. Please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.